here are my 5 favorite ways to work on hip internal rotation in yoga. And these are great to take a look at because a typical yoga practice is actually very external rotation dominant, and there aren't very many opportunities in yoga to actually intentionally go out of our way to work internal rotation. So at the hip joint, when I externally rotate, I turn the toes out if I'm standing. And if I internally rotate, I rotate the toes in. So by and large, yoga is it's more either just neutral, like this high lunge would be like everything is in neutral, or external rotation in, for example, warrior two or any of our side facing warriors, this front hip is in external rotation. And also, in addition to standing poses, we have a lot of hip openers, quote, hip openers in yoga. This category of poses we call hip openers, like pigeon pose and everything in the pigeon family. So here's kind of your classic pigeon, but there's also double pigeon. And there's also, so pigeon is external rotation. And also just want to point out that gomukhasana, where the knees are stacked, this one sometimes is deceptive, and sometimes we think that this is hip internal rotation, but gomukhasana is actually external rotation. And hopefully your movement eyes can see that. Like if I started in double pigeon, which is clearly this is external rotation, I simply adduct. I just adduct my thighs so that the knees stack, and I'm still in external hip rotation. It's just external rotation with adduction. So anyway, just pointing out some of the many examples we have on our hands in yoga in which we move through external rotation, but there are hardly any instances in which we move through internal. So if working on internal hip rotation, like mobility, is a goal of yours, then take a look at these 5 ideas, because these are great ways you can intentionally practice hip internal rotation on the yoga mat. My first suggestion for targeting hip internal rotation in yoga is a standing pose suggestion. And I would call this warrior two to high lunge, but there's a but there. So if you're in warrior two, and then you transition into high lunge, this is actually moving you from external rotation. We rotate to neutral, so just facing forward would be neutral. But if we allow our pelvis to turn even further than that, so we're actually not just facing forward, but we're facing more, say, toward that front right corner of the mat, then we're actually moving into hip internal rotation in the standing hip. So I like a practice of, and I know I'm just showing warrior two in the lower body here, I'm not doing the arms right now, but I would go warrior two to high lunge and then past high lunge so that my pelvis keeps twisting. And then I could unwind that, open all the way back out into warrior two. And then I could go back, and remember the deal is we need to turn further than just facing forward. You could add the arms. So you could do warrior two, and then the arms go up into high lunge, but it's high lunge and a little bit more. And then we open back out into warrior two. So this would be a nice way to work through really just a full hip rotational range of motion in this front hip from all the way external to all the way internal. My second suggestion for working on hip internal rotation in a yoga setting is with half frog pose. So if we come into, say this is Sphinx pose where we're up on our forearms, and then we frog pose one leg. I'm just calling it half frog because I don't have both legs in frog position, just this one. So we're here, and then, so this is neutral hip rotation in that left leg, but then I can add on internal by trying to lift that left foot, and then I set it back down. And then I can just keep doing these lifts here. So everything else just holds still, and I work to actively lift and lower this left foot, and that's going to be taking this left hip joint into internal rotation. So this is a great way that, just right on the yoga mat, right from Sphinx pose, you can just add on a little half frog leg and do some foot lifts, and there's some good internal rotation mobilizing. My third favorite way to target hip internal rotation in yoga is to use a seated pose that's already built into the yoga practice, but we're going to add a little twist to it. So this pose is Bharadvjasana, and you may be familiar with it. It's a classic yoga pose, but I find it to be a little on the less common side. But in Bharadvajasana, we have one hip in external rotation and one hip in internal rotation. So the pose itself already is a position of hip internal rotation. So this is like one of the rare yoga poses that actually does have internal rotation as part of it. So that's good to know. But then I like to, once I come here, I like to kind of add on, like focusing on the hip internal rotation by adding a little movement here in which I rotate toward the hip internal rotated leg, and then I rotate back forward. So just turning toward the hip that's in internal rotation will further accentuate the hip internal rotation, and then I can rotate forward again. So just these Bharadvajasana rotations, I might call them, where we're just kind of dynamically turning toward that leg and then turning forward again. This can be a great way to kind of dynamically mobilize into internal rotation. And just an FYI, that sitting directly on the floor like this is not necessarily comfortable for everyone with regard to hip mobility. So one idea for making this a little more comfortable, a little more accessible, is to simply elevate your hips. So you can sit up on a yoga block or a bolster or something like that. And that often that will give us a little more space. And it often can provide enough space that sitting here is more accessible and more comfortable. My fourth favorite way to target hip internal rotation in a yoga context is with side lying hip internal rotation. So this looks like this, lying on our side, knees bent, and we have our legs stacked. And then you might know a kind of common movement, which is like called a clamshell, where we lift the top knee off the bottom knee. And this movement would be working external rotation in the top hip. So that's like the opposite direction of movement of interest here. But if we were to keep the knees together and instead lift the top foot, that would be rotating our hip into internal rotation. That would be actively internally rotating this top hip. So we could be here on our side and do these foot lifts, and this would be a great way to work on active hip internal rotation in just this simple sideline position that we can easily do right on the yoga mat. My fifth favorite way to target hip internal rotation in yoga is with something called quadruped hip arcs. So for quadruped hip arcs, we start in quadruped position and we step one foot out to the side. This is like the starting position. And I just want to show you this like base position from the front so you have this angle. But then I'm going to turn to the side and show you how this works. I like to use a yoga block here. I find that it makes the movement more effective, but you can also do this without the block. That is optional. But so here I am in quadruped with my leg out to the side. And then I'm going to arc my foot up and over the block and then back, but I'm going to involve hip rotation in order to make that happen. So I start by lifting my heel, and that is internally rotating my hip. And then I lead with the heel as I lift up, and then I set the heel down. Now I'm behind the block. Then I lead with the toes and I turn down so the toes come down and the heel comes up. So I am arcing up, and it's hard. My core has to work to stabilize here. I'm arcing up and over the block, and as I'm doing that, I'm rotating my hip through internal and external rotation. So this is the quadruped hip arc, and I actually included this same movement in another video I have, which is 5 ways to target the hip external rotators. And that's because the quadruped hip arc actually moves through a full range of hip rotation. So we get internal rotation and external rotation all actively and all with control. But while this fits really well if your goal is to target external rotation, it equally fits if your goal is our goal today, which is to target internal rotation, because we get that in the range of motion as well. It's really, once again, like a full hip rotational range of motion movement. Those are my 5 favorite ideas for intentionally targeting hip internal rotation on the yoga mat. If you appreciated this content, subscribe to my channel so you can stay up to date on all of the tips that I share.